We're going to continue now with a focus just primarily on the history of U.S. foreign policy in the region. To give us some more insight into that, we are going to hear from Ambassador David Newton. During his 36-year career in the U.S. Foreign Service, Ambassador Newton served in numerous positions. He participated as a special envoy for public diplomacy to the Middle East during the February-March 1998 Iraq crisis. Previously, he had served as the U.S. ambassador to Yemen and Iraq during 1994-97 and 1984-1988, respectively. With his years of experience as a diplomat, Ambassador Newton was the International Affairs Advisor and Chairman for the Department of National Security Policy at the National War College here in Washington. Moreover, he served as an advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the first Gulf War. From 1998 to 2004, he worked as Director of Radio Free Iraq. His other positions include Deputy Chief of Mission in Yemen and Syria, Political Counselor in Saudi Arabia, State Department Director for Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, and Near East Division Chief in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador David Newton.
Well, maybe you can see I've been around too long. I come from a generation that was still kind of fascinated by the romance of the Middle East. I think a lot of that romance has disappeared. But I started at age 11 when my father took me to see the Egyptology collection at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And so I ended up majoring in anthropology and history. Then towards the end got interested in the medieval Arab world and later got my degree in that subject. But you can see, I also, together with my wife, we went to, a long time ago, to Beirut to spend 2 years studying Arabic, already in the Foreign Service. At that point, I looked around not knowing all that much about the modern Middle East, and I thought to myself, I don't want to spend my whole life pushing this rock of the Arab-Israel issue uphill and watching it roll down again. So I decided to focus on U.S.-Arab relations. I can't say that's turned out so well either, but that's the way it goes. Well, but I am fascinated by history, as I'm sure many of you are. So it's nice to talk about something with history in the title. I always like to remind people, of course, that history is Einstein's fourth dimension, time. But actually, that's not my favorite definition of history, which is one damn thing after another. And since I'm going to talk about 200 years of history, I guess I'll have to talk a little bit about some of those one things after another. I will try not to duplicate with what I heard from John, but inevitably you have to get into the Arab-Israel issue, the Palestinian issue, but I'm trying to talk about it in the perspective of how it affects relations between the United States and the Arab world. And I have to say from the beginning that the trend is, if you look over the period 200 years, or especially 150 years, the trend is all down. There are some peaks when it looked better, but the overall trend is notably down. And I think you could divide this history into two eras. I won't spend too much time on the first, but there are some important points. And I would just, for simplicity's sake, call them pre-Cold War, Cold War, and post-Cold War. And they're also, I think, useful to think about in the middle of these periods, a little less clear, of course, than the last one. There is kind of a particular event. And these events are usually wars, because wars are really the benchmarks in the Middle East. And so for the pre-Cold War, the benchmark really is World War I. For the second, the Cold War period, the benchmark is the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, which dramatically changed U.S.-Israeli relations. And finally, the post-Cold War, I guess you could say, 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq. I was glad to hear John say something about that in 2003. This is all approximate, but I think it still makes sense. But talk about the first. You can actually think the first U.S.-Arab contacts going back about 200 years. They're not very great, and they were mostly maritime contacts. We all know about the Barbary pirates and so forth. That's one of them. But also, the United States was maybe the last major maritime power to get out into the Indian Ocean. And so in the first decade of the 19th century, the United States clipper ships out of Salem, Massachusetts, did a great deal of trade with the port of Mocha in Yemen, which was then the source of coffee, of course. Only lasted for about 10 years, but also there are known ship visits and indeed shipwrecks in Oman on the other end of the southern coast of Arabia. But what really marked the beginning of any sustained contact between people was the arrival in 1819 of Presbyterian Congregationalist ministries in historical Syria, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine. They went out. There's been a lot written about these missionaries. Many of them most of them, I think, came from Massachusetts, my home state. The men from Amherst, the women from Smith, Mount Holyoke, where our daughter went to college. And they went there full of zeal, with a low opinion of Arabs and a low opinion of Islam. But as they stayed there over many years, these opinions changed slowly. Originally, they came determined to convert the Muslim Arab world to Christianity. You can imagine how that turned out. Maybe they got one or two, I'm not sure. And then, of course, they began to turn they centered particularly in Beirut, and they began then to focus on medical, but particularly on educational efforts. And they founded a lot of institutions. And in the process, they converted a lot of local Christians to Protestantism, especially Greek Orthodox. And they founded the most famous place they founded was the Syrian Protestant College, which in 1920 became the American University of Beirut and is still going strong. They've also founded other places, Robert College, which now belongs to the Turkish government in Istanbul, later Beirut College for Women, which is now Beirut University College, and they were perhaps the first to really focus on educated women in the Arab world. And then much later in 1920, the American University in Cairo, which played, obviously, their graduates an important role in the uprising in the Arab Spring in Cairo in the last few months. And they, in the process, they educated, especially, as I say, quite a few Arab Christians who became quite prominent and who developed a very positive view of the United States. They saw these people who were dedicated and were doing a great deal and said, these must be pretty nice people. Now, in addition, there was a different group of people from New York, from the Dutch Reformed Church, who went out to the Persian Gulf, known to Arabs as the Arabian Gulf, and who did a great focus particularly on medical work in Iraq until the '58 revolution, but particularly in Bahrain and in Oman, where they're still remembered very fondly for the work they did in an area which was even poorer and more in need of both medical and educational help even than Beirut. Of course, there were a few others. There were American archaeologists from early on in the 19th century in Nippur in Iraq, of course, well-known American archaeologists working for ancient Egypt. So this was a very positive start. One should not over-glamorize this. I mean, it's still the 19th century. This is still the age of imperialism, colonialism, when people who went out from the white West, Europe or the United States, felt they were superior and that their civilization was superior, and they would bring, these people, of course, were convinced, of course, that Christianity was superior to Islam and that they were bringing all these benefits to people. But they did bring a lot of benefits. And, of course, many Muslims also benefited, not religiously, obviously, but they benefited from the education. And so this relatively small elite, which was heavily Christian, really developed a very positive view of the United States. And this feeling lasted quite a long time. And it was really, you could see missionary activities, not in conversion, but in these fields, still visible up through the 1960s. I mean, the institutions have survived, like American University of Beirut, but the whole idea of this educational or medical missionary is no longer in play. But you developed also some very positive writers, some Arab American, others Arabs exposed to America. Some of you may be familiar with Amin Rayhani, who wrote some very interesting books, but of course the best known of these writers is Khalil Gibran, who in fact illustrated the best known book of Amin Rayhani, the book of Khalid. And to give you an idea of how the missionary views, which are quite popular, changed, here's a brief quote from the president of the American University of Beirut, Howard Bliss, who was the son of the founder of the university. Now, this is a missionary speaking, and he says, "The modern missionary accepts ungrudgingly and gratefully that Christianity is not the sole channel through which divine and saving truth has been conveyed. The missionary comes to supplement, not solely to create. He prays for men with a new sympathy for all mosques, temples, and synagogues, as well as for all churches and all churches." So this is 1920. This is not 2011. So you can see this is a pretty liberal and tolerant view, fortunately, and it affected the Arabs with whom he dealt. Now, I'd say the turning point was particularly World War I, of course, and that is directly related to President Woodrow Wilson and the 14 points, who made a speech before Congress in which he covered the 14 points. He actually didn't use the word self-determination, but the whole idea is present in his talk. And again, you listen to what he says, and you realize a different spirit. He says, "An evident principle runs through the whole program I have outlined. It is the principle of justice to all peoples and nationalities and their right to live on equal terms of liberty and safety with one another, whether they are strong or weak." At the same time, when Wilson got to Paris, he realized this isn't going to happen, really. I mean, the strong powers were Britain and France. Wilson was a visionary, but not a very experienced politician, and really was, there's a fascinating book, and I've forgotten the name, called 1919, which talks about the peace conference, and it's remarkably disorganized, and the American view, I'm afraid, never gets put into effect politically. He could see what was going to happen was that the British and French were going to divide up the Arab world, at least especially the Arab East, and give them the euphemistic term of mandate to supposedly prepare them for democracy. But in fact, these were at least quasi-colonies. And he also began to see that the Arabs, he had aroused what was going to be unrealistic expectations among the Arabs of what might happen to them. So he was, at the same time, say a little bit about the British and French, especially the British. The British were in a difficult situation. They had, to win support in World War II, they had made 3 different promises. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. They had told the king of the Hejaz, who thought he would be the king of the Arab world, that all of this self-determination was going to be applied to all of this area, except the coastal areas west of 4 Syrian cities, Homs, Hama, Damascus, and Aleppo. He had also secretly divided up the Arab world with the French under the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was secret until the Russian Revolution and the Bolsheviks knew about it and published it. And then, of course, the third one, the more famous one perhaps, is the Balfour Declaration, by Lord Balfour, the Foreign Secretary. According to the one Jewish member of the British cabinet, Lord Balfour was actually known as an anti-Semite. So he had two basic reasons for this. Number one, there were Jewish companies in the Western Europe who'd been very important for the war effort, especially in munitions, and they wanted to naturally recruit as many people to their side, so they wanted to appeal to European Jewry. And the other one, Balfour was noted as saying, Jews will never fit in our society in Great Britain, so this was a way of getting rid of your unwanted population, send them off to Palestine. And of course, now the British were in a dilemma because they had made three really entirely different promises to three different people. And now Wilson was being pressed to take a position. So when you're in a difficult position, what to do is you're American, you commission a study, right? We know this very well. So he called for an inter-allied commission, British, French, and American. They would go to the Middle East, they would talk to the Arab population and find out what they wanted. And the League of Nations was coming into effect and had legalized these mandates which said that the opinion of the local people was a very important consideration in who would be the mandatory power. So, well, the French wanted nothing to do with this. The British, who were cynical about it, then decided they wouldn't go. So only two Americans went with a group of came known as the King Crane Commission. Dr. King was the president of Oberlin College. Mr. Crane was a well-known manufacturer whose name you may recall many times when you use the rest facilities, because he was the head of the Crane Plumbing Company. But they went off there. They were full of Wilsonian zeal. They went out and told everybody we're on a fact-finding mission. They talked widely. The British wouldn't let them into Egypt or Iraq. But they talked widely in what was historical Syria, again, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and they got an earful. The people they were enthralled by the fact that somebody is actually coming out and asking them what they want to do, and so they talked to these people, and especially the people in Damascus, and these people all said, we want independence. If we have to have a mandatory partner, we would like the United States, first of all, because you're not a colonial power. If we can't get the United States, we could, if we have to, take Great Britain if the mandate was limited to economic and technical things, but under no conditions do we want the French. And we also want one state, one government, and we want self-determination. So and they also went through parts of southern Turkey, what is now southern Turkey, and came back to Paris and reported to President Wilson, sent a copy to the White House. And that's the last thing was ever heard of the King Crane Commission report for 3 years. Wilson knew that it was a hopeless case. The Americans were fading away in Paris, and of course, Wilson was also, as you know, fading away politically. He lost the vote to join the League of Nations, and he went off kind of to political oblivion and bad health. So nothing came out of that, but it left behind, again, this was a real, already the United States was looked at favorably, and this left a big boost for the United States in the region. We were out there supporting self-determination, and even if it didn't work, it was a nice try. Now, in fact, we accepted reality. We saw Britain and France were setting up these quasi-colonies, and we went along with that. There was not much choice. We didn't have that much influence. Even the educational missionaries accepted that. After all, they were white Europeans, right? So we felt they were like us. But still, we got a lot of good credit. Now, other things, of course, were happening. What was happening, of course, was that in Palestine, things were getting worse as the number of of Jewish immigrants grew and grew. The opposition of the Palestinians, I'm sure John covered some of this, so I won't, certainly I don't want to go over it in detail, but the opposition grew and it started to get violent on both sides. There was terrorism and killing on both sides. But this was really essentially a British problem. The United States was not that much involved in it. So as one other thing just to mention briefly, of course, in the 30s, we began to get interested in Middle East oil. We had gotten a piece of the British organized concession in Iraq, and then Standard Oil of California went to Bahrain, found some oil, and in the 30s they went over to Saudi Arabia, and after I think 6 dry wells, they had a real gusher in Dammam, number 7, and Aramco was born, and a long history of U.S. relations began with Saudi Arabia, but there wasn't much production, and it was shut in during World War II. And one other thing happened, I think, mentioning was that the British, badly strained, could no longer support Saudi Arabia, which was very poor, if you can believe that. So we took over the food aid and the modest technical assistance. And after World War II, we sent them a lot of surplus equipment and so forth. So in the war, of course, the United States had a bigger presence in the area, and to a degree, our presence and influence began to grow. So at the end of this first period, pre-Cold War, we were in pretty good shape. After that, not so good. And of course, starting with the second period, the Cold War, 2 major events. Number one, 1946, the Iron Curtain goes up, and suddenly we're beginning to get the idea the Soviet Union is our greatest threat. And number 2, of course, Israel. 1947, a General Assembly resolution accepted a report from a commission sent out there. Interestingly, this Anglo-American commission accepted the fact that Jewish immigration and Arab self-determination were incompatible. But they fell back on the ideas which had come from this age early around the turn of the century of high imperialism, and that is white Western Europeans with a higher culture and everything would bring benefit to benighted people of the third world. Now, if a little aside for a moment, just to give you a personal view, one of the great problems that Zionism had is that it was conceived in this era of high imperialism. And in fact, mainstream Zionism specifically talked about what the British came to call the white man's burden, to quote Kipling, or what the French called the civilizing mission civilisatrice. And they said, we're going to bring all these benefits to the local Palestinians. Well, hard pressed to find the benefits, I guess. But the fact is, if, in my view, if the problem with Zionism was it was conceived in the era of high imperialism, but it wasn't actually implemented until the period of anti-colonialism. If they'd done it a century earlier, maybe the Palestinians would have ended up like Native Americans. They wouldn't have had much say over what happened to them. But by the time, because of the Holocaust, that the real rush of immigrants came to Palestine, anti-colonialism was in full swing, and the Palestinians and other Arabs were not about to take it lying down, even if they didn't do very well. So you can talk, if you're talking about this whole period of this Cold War going up to 1989-90, you can look, I think, at three trends. One is very much the growing U.S. role, which was 45-46 was still pretty minimal, became more and more powerful, Pax Americana, if you will. I went out in 1990 to give a series of lectures for the U.S. Information Agency right after the Desert Storm, and the title of this trip was called The New World Order, when we haven't heard much about the New World Order since we seem to have a lot of New World disorder. in recent times. But also, in the second half of this period, as oil grew, you began to get a split in the Arab world in the terms of the countries of the Gulf, where our presence was growing. They became very much focused on strategic issues and on the U.S. strategic protection for them against, to a degree, against the Soviet Union, but of course, particularly later, against the new Iranian regime of Khomeini. So you began to get a split in the Arab world. I'm not saying they weren't interested in the Palestinian issue, but they were more focused on their own security, whereas the people in the Levant, if you will, tended to focus more on the Palestinian issue. The second one was the ever-growing alliance, ever closer alliance between the United States and Israel. And as I say, the real benchmark for this, the turning point, is the '67 war. But there's also another point is, well, this is your right. And so as the United States is growing closer to Israel, Israel is moving steadily politically to the right. So in the 1950s, it had a very dovish government, but now we got into ages where two prime ministers actually had been the heads of terrorist organizations who had killed British mandatory personnel. Of course, that's Begin and Shamir. And now we have a very hard-wing government, not only with Netanyahu, but with a prime minister that even his own government doesn't want him to speak because he's so far to the right, and who says that Muslim Israelis, which is what they are, should be deprived of their citizenship if they don't take a loyalty oath to the Jewish state. So as the United States moves to Israel, it's kind of a moving target. It's moving more in the right wing. And the third one, a theme of this, is different administrations. And generally, what was the problem in the Middle East? This is the Cold War, remember, and Republican administrations tended to think of the Middle East as one of the regions of the Cold War and to focus mostly on what they saw as the threat of Soviet expansion, especially as the governments were overthrown and these countries without any other alternative turned to the Soviet Union for their weapons. Democratic administrations, this is again as a generalization, tended to deal with the Middle East more in its own terms and see that you had to reach out to Arabs, and that if you, and they also, of course, were concerned about the Soviet Union, but you had to focus more on trying to deal with Arab concerns so they wouldn't turn against you. But things didn't start very well. John, I know, covered the '47 resolution. We did a lot of arm twisting. We were the hyperpower of that day in the General Assembly. I think the vote, if I remember, was 33-13. Had to be 2/3. And we twisted arms of a number of Latin Americas and countries and others to get them to vote for it. The resolution actually created two states, partitioned Palestine into its two states, Jewish and Arab. I know John covered some of this. Jerusalem was to be governed directly by the United Nations in a so-called corpus separatum, fancy Latin name for a separate unit. But of course, as John explained, the Arabs thought this was quite unfair. The Jews were 30%, they owned less than 7% of the land, but they were getting the better 50%. One of the ironies of the emigration of European Jews at this time, the Holy Land, is they did not go up into the drier, more remote areas where Jews came from in antiquity, that is what they call Judea and Samaria, north and south of Jerusalem. They stayed in the coastal area where it was easier to get to, and things were generally better. But the Arabs said, this is totally unfair. We're going to have actually a Jewish state which is going to be 50-50 Jewish and Arab, and the shrunken Arab state is going to be 90% Arab and only 10% Jewish. So they went to war, maybe not a good decision considering the outcome, because Israelis could get foreign help, arms help from the United States, from Czechoslovakia, and the Arab governments, which were post-colonial governments, not elites, not really very representative and rather corrupt, with the exception of Jordan, did a very poor job. And of course, the result was what Palestinians called the Nakba, the disaster. John mentioned how different people in the United States, especially diplomats, viewed this. They were also felt this is also not in our interest because, again, we're in the Cold War and we're alienating all the people of the Middle East, the Arabs, and this will give an opportunity, a long-term opportunity for the Soviets to encroach in the area and will cause a problem generations to come, which, of course, is certainly true. The result, of course, is that with a 50-50 Jewish state was a real problem for Israel. Israel came up with a doctrine that anywhere there was opposition, the Israeli army had the right to destroy villages, which they did with a vengeance, and about a million Arabs were basically driven out. Some fled in fear, of course, hoping to come back, especially driven into Lebanon and Syria to the north. We heard a lot of stories about they left voluntarily, which is certainly not true. To Israel's credit, it has modern historians who have access to archives. And the most prominent one, Benny Morris, started out as a revisionist historian, is now more a supporter of the policies. But he famously said not very many years ago, yes, it was ethnic cleansing, but in this case, ethnic cleansing was justified because the survival of the Jewish people was at stake. So you can take that for what he said in any case. And indeed, the Arabs hoped to go back. They were irredentist and thought that something would happen. And of course, they naturally blamed the United States for all of this. And now the United States is seen as another colonial power because it strongly advocated the creation of Israel. In fact, the British, who wanted out of this, having created the mess, and they were weak and they wanted out, we pushed them very hard. And we eventually ended up taking over. In this early period, we see the first signs of what has really come to bother us now, and that is a young Egyptian cleric named Sayyid Qutb visited the United States in the late 40s. He was a devout fundamentalist Muslim. He was exposed to some racial prejudice. He was rather dark, and he didn't like what he saw in the United States. He actually saw men and women dancing together and such shocking things, and he became quite anti-American. And it's his image which eventually, his views led to the killing of Sadat and led to, of course, to Osama, the late unlamented Osama bin Laden. But more important than the fundamentalists Sayyid Qutb in this region was the fact that traditional Arab governments faced the music because of their bad performance were overthrown, and most notably King Farouk in Egypt. King Farouk thought he was going to be the first of all the kings. He famously said in the future, this is before Queen Elizabeth, that in the future there will only be 5 kings in the world. The kings of England, hearts, diamonds, clubs, and spades. That has not happened in the Arab world. The opposite, if anything, has happened. But so here we saw the rise of Arab nationalism. Eisenhower, who had a great strategic view at the time, saw what was happening, tried to deal with this problem, but nationalism has its own drive and a kind of revolution like that needs enemies, and we could hardly be friends with these people. And in fact, we were of two minds. Nasser saw the Soviet Union, not the Soviet Union as the great enemy, which we did. We were trying to force him into something called the Baghdad Pact, together with Iraq, Iran, Turkey, who would be an anti-communist bloc like NATO. He wasn't interested. He saw the Soviet Union as the great enemy. And this leads us up towards the next major war, 56. Now, Nasser also saw Israel as dangerous for two reasons. Number one, in 1954, the Israelis were concerned about U.S.-Egyptian friendship. And they sent some spies, intelligence agents, into Egypt, recruited some some Egyptian Jews, and they began a firebombing campaign. They firebombed the main train station, the main post office, a number of cinemas, but the most famous thing they did was to firebomb the two libraries of the U.S. Information Agency in Alexandria and Cairo, expecting this would cause trouble between Egypt and the United States. It backfired because all of these people were captured and executed by the Egyptians. It came out in Israel in something called the Lavon Affair. The result of that was the more dovish Prime Minister, Moshe Sharet, was lost office, and the more hawkish Ben-Gurion took over as Prime Minister of Israel. The second one was Palestinians had continued to try to raid into Israel because they were, they didn't want to accept what had happened to them. The Israelis in 1955 conducted a very large military raid into Gaza, which was under Egyptian military occupation, and killed a large number of Egyptian soldiers. So Nasser wanted arms. He asked us for arms. We wouldn't do it. Although we weren't at the time supplying really arms to Israel, the French were arming them. But we wouldn't do it, so he got them from Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia. John Foster Dulles, our Secretary of State, was infuriated by this and canceled $200 million in aid, which was to finance half of the Aswan Dam, which Nasser saw as vital to the development of his country. So he retaliated by nationalizing the Suez Canal, which was still under British control, and although in large part also French-owned. The British were both horrified and furious. The French, because Nasser was supporting the freedom fight in Algeria, and the French, having lost Indochina, said they were not about to lose Algeria, which was part of metropolitan France. So they wanted to get even, so the French questioned the Israelis, how about a war? And they brought the French in, and they concocted a scheme. The Israelis would attack Egypt, drive towards the canal, and then the French and British would call for a ceasefire, demand both sides return 10 kilometers from the canal and land there as an interposition force. It didn't work so well because the Israelis didn't make much progress, and they were already 40 kilometers away from the canal when the British and French issued their ultimatum. So it was obvious what was happening. Eisenhower was absolutely outraged. This coincided with the Soviet invasion of Hungary, and this violated all of his precepts. So he threatened to bring down the pound sterling, which was still a world currency, and told the French to cut it out, which they did. The French and British also no longer had adequate forces to carry out this operation, so it was Willa. So again, we got a bump because we had intervened on a war, and we forced people to withdraw. We forced the Israelis, who held on for months in Gaza and in Sharm el-Sheikh at the south of the Sinai, but finally forced them to withdraw when we threatened to cut off aid. So we got a lot of credit for that. Two things happened, however, which later came to haunt us in '67. Number one, a relatively small UN force called the UN Emergency Force was sent in as an interposition force, but the Israelis would not allow it on the Israeli side, so they settled at Sinai. Secondly, Dulles, as a kind of sop to the Israelis, said he would insist on the opening of the Straits of Tiran, which led out into the Red Sea, as an international waterway. The Egyptians claimed it as territorial waters. Those two things came back to haunt us in '67. But, through this period later, things seemed not bad. We had gotten a real a real boost from the '56 war, and things went on. Meanwhile, and we were the big power. We intervened several times in Syria to overthrow governments. We were consumed by the idea that leftist governments in Syria might turn communist. A few years ago, an interesting article, Freedom of Information, a number of telegrams from the American Defense Attaché in Damascus from this period were published. And the interesting thing to me, there's a book called The Struggle for Syria that's pretty well known. But all these telegrams, they were looking for the right colonel who would be anti-communist. But the thing that was really striking is that he was forever looking at colonels he thought communist, but he didn't use the word communist. He kept referring them all the time to this commie colonel. So kind of shades of Joe McCarthy, and the House Un-American Activities Committee, you could see, was alive and well in the 50s. So, so things had not gone badly, in fact, for the United States, but later things did become, I'm afraid, did become much worse. And that brings us more to '67. Kennedy was more favorable. He had spoken out in Congress in favor of Algerian independence. He tried to have good relations with Nasser, but Kennedy was killed. Johnson was much more favorable to Israel, and we began slowly to provide military equipment to Israel. And Nasser was, after '56, of course, had become the great hero. He wasn't just the leader of Egypt, he was the leader of the entire Arab world. So he became quite famous, and he was pushed by more radicals, and eventually he got carried away, and he made a devastating mistake for himself, for the Egyptians, and for the Arabs. He was very much worried about the Israeli aggression. In the spring of '67, he received a warning that from the Soviet Union, that Israel was going to invade Syria. The report was totally false, but people were convinced at the time. Nobody to this day, one of my older colleagues who passed away recently did a book on this subject. We still don't know whether the Soviets believed this or not, or it was disinformation, but in any way it was totally false. But he decided I could absorb an Israeli first strike, so he called on the United Nations to withdraw their troops from the Sinai. Now, they were only in Sinai, an Egyptian territory, and eventually U Thant said, I have no choice, I have to send them out. The Egyptians sent an army in, and then the second thing disastrous he did was to declare the Straits of Tiran closed to Israeli shipping. And my wife and I were in Yemen at the time as junior officers, and you could see the clock had started to tick. It was just a matter of time before the Israelis struck. The Egyptians thought they were ready. Their Air Force went on alert every early morning at dawn, and then one morning they went up at dawn, nothing happened, so they landed and were having their morning coffee when the Israeli Air Force struck and wiped out the Egyptian Air Force. Jordan foolishly had accepted a unified Arab command. They were under the command of Egyptians. It was a disaster for Jordan. It lost the entire West Bank, and eventually Syria, in the fight, lost the Golan Heights. The United States clearly sympathized with Israel. In fact, there's still a long-time dispute because of the destruction of, I'll pass that over, but the attack on a U.S. ship later. But the result was, of course, disaster for the Arabs, and again, a great change. This was really the peak of Arab nationalism, which in the war became very violent. Even on the airwaves, I can remember listening to Voice of the Arabs from Cairo, Yemeni radio, people just screaming, burn, destroy, kill. There was a real hysteria in the Arab world, and they thought they'd won. Nasser told them they'd won, and then he admitted that they lost, but he said it wasn't our fault because the United States took part in the destruction of my Air Force. it later became known as the Big Lie. But still, the result was a much stronger Israel and a blow to the United States standing among the Arabs. And from then on, it's certainly been generally downhill all the way. There are many other things happened. There was long shelling along from Sinai, the Israelis in Sinai and so forth. And of course, the 73 war, Nasser died. Nasser was disgraced. He eventually died. Sadat took over. Sadat saw there was no choice but to have peace. He made this, you'll remember, I'm sure, his famous trip to Jerusalem. He said when he went there, I didn't come to make a bilateral peace. I came to have a whole peace between the Arabs and Israel. In fact, he was faced with tough negotiations, both from us and the Israelis, and he settled for a bilateral peace deal between Egypt and Israel. The Arab world was left out. The Palestinians got a few nice words. They mostly broke relations, and Egypt became something of a pariah. And then you could see, as this period goes on, towards the end of the Cold War, things begin to get nastier. And you see the rise of extreme fundamentalism, violent fundamentalism in Egypt, which leads eventually in '81 to the killing of Sadat, and later some real violence against tourists, and of course, and then 1979, the fall of the Shah, which completely changes the security equation in the Persian Gulf. The Shah had been the great defender under the Nixon doctrine. He would provide the troops, we would provide the Navy and the air cover. Suddenly this powerful nation was gone to the other side and was extremely expansionist and hostile. It had taken our diplomats hostage for 445 days. One response was, of course, the Iraq had gone to war feeling threatened and having some ambitions. Saddam went to war against Iran, and after a year the war turned against him. We became really afraid that Khomeini would win and would take Iraq and would dominate the Arab world, so we began to provide different kinds of support to Iraq. And of course I was there during the second half of that, 84 to 88. Despite what people tell you, the United States did not provide weapons to Iraq, but what it did provide was, I'm sure many people have spoken about, we provided tactical intelligence so the Iraqis would not be surprised in the annual Iranian offensive, because the Iraqis had no strategic depth. We sold them a lot of, as much as $1 billion a year of various kinds of foods, which some people think of aid, but it was aid, but I think it much more aid to American farmers. We did a great business in Iraq, and until the crisis hit with Kuwait, the Iraqis paid their bills on time and kept to the terms of the agreement. And we became very much focused. And of course, during this period also, after the time we had become focused in the Nixon administration on China, on Vietnam, not on the Palestinian-Israeli issue. The Israelis had begun building settlements more and more. One of the issues I think we will have to face in the future is, and to be blunt about it, is the Holocaust one of the most terrible things that has ever happened in human history? Can it be used by Israel as a kind of permanent get-out-of-jail-free card to see itself as above international law, even international law which itself has signed, including, John went through the Fourth Geneva Convention, but also issues of war crimes and crimes against humanity. I was there last year leading a group, and I was given a very hostile reception, strangely, by a young Canadian Israeli. What I was trying to say was Israel has felt it's been served well by using two instruments, the military instrument and the security instrument. But these, in my view, these instruments are becoming less and less useful. You could see that in the in the ships that tried to go to Gaza when they killed 9 Turks, including a Turkish American. But also they had this brilliant intelligence operation in Dubai in which they killed one of the leaders of Hamas. The leaders of Hamas can be easily replaced. And this was a brilliant operation from the security point of view, a political disaster. They had been able quietly to go to the Gulf, to the Emirates and so forth, and do business. And suddenly that was all shut off. And they forged some real passports with real names of people who had Jewish Europeans and so forth who'd come to Israel for the 25 people they sent in for the operation, including Germany, Britain, Canada, any number of countries. And these Western European countries were all furious. And the Israelis, whose names had been used, now can't really travel very much. The names are on everyone's list. And there was a great deal of criticism. In any case, again, we had, more settlements, the United States getting closer and closer, aid to Israel, and of course, much activity in the United States. And so that brings us then to the third period, to the post-Cold War period, 89, 90. It's the fall of the Soviet Union, and of course, Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, in which many Arabs participated on our side, gave us something of a boost. The Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia, did actually do some fighting. The Egyptians and Syrians sent armies, but really didn't do much. Their contribution was really their presence. And Israeli misbehavior was very obvious. Iraqi misbehavior was obvious to see. Interestingly enough, the Kuwaitis got very little sympathy in the Arab world for 2 reasons. Popular sympathy. Again, split, as we see increasingly, between governments and people. Number one, Arabs saw the Kuwaitis as rich and arrogant. And to a degree, they certainly were rich, and in many cases they had been arrogant. Number two, as much as they didn't like Saddam, they said, at least here's someone who's sticking it in the eye of the United States and its friends in the Arab world. So while a friend of mine who was the public affairs officer in Tunis said he would come out with all this material about the terrible things the Iraqis were doing to Kuwaitis, he got absolutely no response, no response from the Tunisians, who said, well, too bad. We don't particularly like the Kuwaitis anyway. And then, of course, afterwards, Saddam failed to keep the conditions of the ceasefire, which was to turn over his weapons of mass destruction to the United Nations. The sanctions were then on for well over 10 years, and you began to see it served its purpose. It kept Saddam from ever launching another war, but it brought a lot of suffering to the Iraqi people, who already had suffered through 8 difficult years of war with Iran, in which they lost many, many of their family members, and in which the economy went steadily down. All of this alienated a lot of Arabs towards the United States. One of the conditions for getting Arabs to come and join, of course, in Desert Storm was that we had promised a real effort at peace. That led to the Madrid conference. I was there as the liaison officer for the Israeli-Syrian talks, and it was a moment of hope. But unfortunately, on one side, Shamir was the Israeli prime minister. And his people, I knew his chef de cabinet. They had absolutely no interest. They were only doing it because we made them come. The Palestinians didn't help themselves. But, and then it was a year of talks here in Washington between Israel and different Arab delegations, which basically went absolutely nowhere. So subsequently, we've had other efforts. More recently, George Bush, of course, had made an effort, George H.W. Bush. That didn't work. There was, after that, not much interest. Clinton, towards the last 6 months, finally decided to make an effort. Meanwhile, settlements were growing, nothing had happened. And he pushed Arafat, who was to come to Washington for a conference with the Israelis for a peace effort. Arafat didn't want to come. He didn't think it would lead to anything, and it didn't. Meanwhile, the U.S. approach had changed, starting with George H.W. Bush. They accepted the argument, which I would say made sense to me at the time, to a degree, that the best way to get an arrangement is to turn the peace effort over to pro-labor, pro-peace Jewish Americans. And from that time on, basically, the American effort on peace has been in the hands of well-meaning and some very good Jewish Americans. But the idea behind it was we as Jewish Americans can relate to the Israelis. We will get the most generous possible offer, and then this is something that the Palestinians can gratefully accept. These offers have never seemed acceptable to the Arabs, and they didn't like the idea. They felt they were outnumbered 2-1, and that they didn't see anything coming out of this. There was a lot of, and Arafat was pushed. He went there on promise from Clinton that he would not be blamed if it didn't work. But when it didn't work, Clinton was so angry about this that he publicly attacked Arafat and blamed him for the collapse of the conference, which didn't help matters anyway. It was said that the Israelis were giving back 95%. In fact, they were giving back sovereignty for about 90%, but they were keeping another 10% more or less in perpetuity, which covered the whole line of the Jordan River with Jordan, which meant the state would be cut off on all sides, had no control over its airspace, no control over its water. The aquifer in the West Bank actually provides most of the water to Israel. And of course, they would have very little ability to be in East Jerusalem. And secondly, the Israeli settlements would basically remain, and they would get some desert territory in recompense, which was only a fraction of what they were giving up. They didn't see it as generous. We saw it as generous. The Israelis claimed it was generous, but in essence, it never led to anything. Go on from there, of course, that George W. Bush, I think, paid really no attention to the problems. He was under extreme pressure from the Saudis. He did call for a two-state solution the first time this happened. But in the meantime, of course, life goes on and settlements go on. I have to say that finally it's come to the current administration. I'm honest, I voted for Obama for president, and I expect to vote for him a second time. But I have to say that the effort he made was the most amateurish, ill-conceived effort I've ever seen at peace. You don't draw lines in the sand or red lines unless you're really willing to keep to them. It would be better not to make the demand if you're not willing to stand up for it. And I'm afraid the only result is now the Palestinians do have a quasi-government in the West Bank, but no territory. This came out of the Oslo Agreement. The first time the Palestinians gave up on us and went secretly to the Norwegians to try to get a deal. But they understood that if they are allowed this Palestinian Authority with some self-government and so forth to create the institutions of a state, this would lead to a Palestinian state. Now they believe that the Israeli purpose of this is to have the Palestinian Authority as an alternative to a Palestinian state, and this is not acceptable. And they have been saying for the last couple of years, Hanan Ashrawi's been saying this, we're not going into any more negotiations for the sake of negotiations. We want a final settlement and results. So now what they're saying is, we are going to go to the United Nations and demand a recognition of a Palestinian state. In the meantime, they have been going around, especially in Latin America, and getting recognition of a state of Palestine. And I think it looks like everyone has or will sign on except Colombia, where we have influence. But to go to the United Nations, you first have to get beyond the Security Council. And the United States just vetoed a resolution in which we said we agreed with the substance about settlements, but we thought this was unhelpful to the peace process. I'm not sure what the peace process is, but in any case. And if they could get beyond the Security Council, then they would go to the General Assembly, and then we accepted, of course, by an overwhelming vote. The Israelis are very much concerned about this because this brings, again, legal issues. After all, how long can you keep a people under military occupation when they have no rights? We ourselves said with Germany and Japan, after a few years, this is not right. We don't want to keep doing this, and we established local governments. The Israelis have kept the Arabs in military occupation now for 44 years. And there have been 2 intifadas, uprisings, in which many more Palestinians than Israelis were killed, including 3 times as many Palestinian children as Israeli children. You wouldn't know that from the American press coverage of these incidents, but it's true. So, but if Palestine is a state, then the whole legal issue of keeping them under military occupation and actions which constitute, or would, I think, constitute in the world of the International Criminal Court and others as either crimes against humanity or war crimes. This brings up a whole lot of unpleasant issues, and it again points to the fact that Israel, I think, has to find other ways of dealing with this issue other than military or the military or security instrument. So, but we're now entering, and this is a history talk, so I'm not really talking much about the future, but we're entering a very turbulent and unpredictable period in the Arab world, as you well know, which could easily turn out very badly and could lead to more terrorism, more instability, or could lead to, we would hope, to democracy and self-government, and probably will lead to some of both. But in the meantime, we, since 9/11 especially, have been exposed to a lot of terrorism as Arab and Muslim ill will has turned from nationalism to extremists in the religious side. And we now think and worry about, what about the next time? What if these people get weapons of mass destruction? This is, of course, the doomsday scenario for the United States and things that our government has to think about. So it's going to be a tricky 10, 15, maybe even 20 years for the United States if we've never really faced this problem because it's domestically too difficult. We do now have a Jewish organization called J Street, which opposes the American Israel Public Affairs Committee and calls for peace. It's trying, but it's kind of outnumbered. The final word I would say, Arabs still admire us very much for what we are for and what we aspire to be and what our principles are. What they don't like is the way we behaved and the way we have not lived up to our principles and why we have never given them a fair hearing and why we have allowed domestic politics to entirely dominate. I know John said this, but I was struck by a friend of mine who's also retired, who spent a couple of years on public affairs dealing with Congress from the State Department and did the Near East. And he said when he would go up there on issues, the first question he would get from the staff is, what is AIPAC's position on this issue? If your position is not the same as AIPAC, we're going to have difficulty with what you're proposing. And as you can see from the last visit of Prime Minister Netanyahu, no one would ever dare be anything in Congress, would be anything less than zealous in proposing positive things for Israel. We saw that with the report done by the South African jurist who investigated what happened in Gaza a few years ago. And although he is a Zionist, a Jewish, and on the board of advisors for Hebrew universities, he was accused of being an anti-Semite because he said he documented many Israeli crimes in Gaza. He documented Palestinian ones as well. He was partly hampered by the fact that the Israelis wouldn't let him in or let him talk to any of the Israeli military, but he did his best. He's a very distinguished person, Goldstein, and nevertheless, he was condemned. If you say things yourself, be prepared, if you feel that way, that other people will not take it kindly. In any case, that's the history. It's not a very happy one. Well, I think we're running out of time, so thank you very much for listening.